This is episode 378 of our podcast, The Journey, a conversation on leadership, culture, and creativity. My name is Vidal, and I want to thank you again for allowing us to have this dialogue over concerns and topics that definitely they make a difference in our culture today. Today is Friday, which is February the 7th, and today is a special day. It's a special morning because today at 10 a.m. we will celebrate the life, the legacy of my brother, one of my best people that I ever met, which is my brother Jay Springfield. Jay went to be with Jesus, and today is a day when we simply come together and we remember what Jesus has done through him. And again, for me, I got the privilege to walk with him for a few years. Because I've only been here for 7 years. So the last 7 years is basically just enjoying his company and Donna as a wife and just seeing God at work. Nothing but just beautiful memories, nothing but just this amazing privilege to see God building their lives, building their marriage, and specifically with Jay, even through some of the most difficult times that he faced as he was dealing with illness. You can see God at work. And on days like this, when families, when loved ones go through the separation, which is a temporary separation, when they go through grief and the experience of pain and suffering, this is the time where we unavoidably bring the reality that we live life in a world where we face the unresolved tension of the Jesus who has come to this world and he has established his kingdom, and yet his kingdom hasn't been consummated. We are in a world where we have the reality of this morning where we're going to celebrate and we're going to gather together to speak of the hope and the certainty of a future. And yet this is the morning where we have to speak also of the reality of a temporary separation. Now, in the Bible, some of these terms are described in a manner where they are prescribed as judgment and hope and restoration. When I talk about this kind of unresolved tension. And this is the reality of all of us, because although God exercises judgment, God is hope, God is restoration, God is love, God is grace. And although conceptually or doctrinally we may embrace things like this, and I know as we gather this morning and we celebrate the life of my brother Jay, we may touch on these principles. We may touch on the reality of death. We may touch on the reality that this is something that is the consequence of our rebellion, of the judgment of God, that God had no choice. He had to exercise the legal component of the legal, treason that we committed before him and we sinned when we chose death instead of life. So as humans, we were all affected by it. We continue to be affected by it. We, as people, we will eventually find ourselves in the situation where my brother Jay found himself a couple of days ago when he went to be with Christ. And yet we're going to preach, we're going to sing, we're going to speak, we're going to celebrate the hope, the certainty, the reality of the life that has been fully restored. The question is not whether we face this reality. The question is, how do we navigate this? The question is not simply that we grieve and we mourn and we suffer. The question is, how do you bring together the sense of helplessness with the sense of hope and reality and restoration and the thing that you're going to move forward in this life? Well, here's the principle that I believe the Bible teaches. When you find yourselves in a situation like this, you have to begin understanding that the unresolved tension of life, again, I'm just giving you the judgment and the hope and the restoration as an unresolved tension, is that we must, in Jesus, here's the point, in Jesus did not come to resolve the tension. Jesus did not come to simply make it easy for us to navigate the tension. Jesus came to empower us to stop trying to resolve the tension. I don't believe it's an either or. I think the Bible gives us enough evidence, and I'm fixing to show you one, where the win is not the absence of the tension. The win is not the absence of this struggle that here we are, again, grieving and mourning the loss of a loved one, and yet here we find the hope and the certainty and the restoration of a brand new life. See, Jesus didn't come to give us an either one, but Jesus came to remind us that his kingdom is present, yet hasn't been consummated. That although we go through the valley of the shadow and death, and sometimes it is the same shepherd that allows us to go through those things, yet I will literally I will want absolutely nothing because he is my shepherd. Because the win is not the absence of the valley and the shadow and death. The win is that he is our shepherd. Now, in reality, when you look at our lives, and again, we go through this unresolved tension of life that we're describing right now, this is the time where we have to remind ourselves that just as God is hope and restoration, that's what you're saying, he is grace, he is loved, God exercises judgment. God is the God who has to exercise and he has to execute things that they describe his character, not just the violation of his law. The same principle applies to us, and this is why I want us to think about in the concept of the people who we are, the people of God, the people of the covenant, and yet many times we choose to exercise disobedience. And I'm saying this because once again, our tendency is to choose either one. I get questions often through this podcast and other conversations where people may question their salvation. People may question whether, as a Christian, can you be demonically possessed? Can you be influenced by Satan? I think those questions are extremely legit, and I think we all go through those phases of doubting and questioning and sometimes even discouragement, especially when you are in the middle of the unresolved tension. But somehow in the conversation, what the Bible is going to help us to remind ourselves is that once again, the Bible presents truth in an unresolved tension component. The Bible is the book and the teaching of Jesus that he's going to say, if you want to be the first one, you got to be the last one. If you want to gain your life, you're going to have to lose it. So our Western kind of a 21st century mindset worldview always wants to bring questions that typically the Bible never asks. And one of them is, which one of these are? I mean, am I really saved, or now that I have done X, Y, and Z, have I lost my salvation? Legit questions, wrong perspective. Because I'm going to say this again. Those questions are coming from this unresolved tension on a Friday like this, where we grieve and we mourn and yet we celebrate. So which one is it? And I'm saying yes. I think the answer is yes. I think is the two of them. Why? Well, again, going back to the people of God, going back to the Bible, going back to our very own legacy and story. I think we are the people of God. I think God brought us into a covenantal relationship that is unbreakable, unshakable. That is a relationship that cannot be taken away from anyone. The Apostle Paul speaks in Romans chapter 8 about how nothing can separate us from the love of God. Yet, that is not an indictment. That is not a loophole that we can just disobey as we want and simply do whatever we want. See, that's not freedom. Freedom is simply the ability to obey and to trust in the trustworthiness of God in spite of how real the unresolved tension is felt, its experience is tangibly present in our lives. Because I'm going to say this again. In many cases, people have disobeyed the Lord because in the both end of the conversation, they wanted to choose either one, and God said, "You are my people." And you are my people not because of your obedience, but in spite of your disobedience. So in this case, again, the book of Isaiah, which is what I want us to just briefly touch on this conversation, is the book that is written in a context where Isaiah has to speak to the people who they have forgotten who they were based on the covenant, and they were finding their identity based on their behavior. I think that's your story and my story. We constantly forget who we are based on what Jesus has done, and we base our identity on the things that we have done or the things that we are trying to do or the things that we missed doing, whatever the case may be. Well, this is the context where Isaiah, on a day like this, reminds us, because if you notice chapter 6 of Isaiah, this is where the conversation gets really deep and very serious with Isaiah as he's called to be the prophet of a nation that is in this unresolved tension, and conveniently or naively they're trying to resolve the tension. So I'm going to say this once again before I read the passage. Let's be careful not to go through life through the unresolved tension of a funeral service, unresolved tension of a marriage conflict, unresolved tension of a doctor's diagnosis, and try and think that God exists to help me resolve the unresolved tension. That will be a cosmic butler. God is no cosmic butler. He's not here to simply make life, the best life ever. See, that's not the gospel. What the gospel is, if you look at Isaiah chapter 6, verse 1, it says that in the year that King Uzziah, if God resolved tension, the Bible will say King Uzziah healed, King Uzziah avoid death. King Uzziah had a much better, prosperous kingdom. What the Bible is saying that in spite of the godliness of this brother, and in spite of the success that he experienced as a king, and you got to remember, kings, prophets, priests, they were the voice of God in this time in history. So here you have someone that was appointed by God to fulfill a task, and yet he finds himself, King Uzziah, in a situation where he's going to die. And obviously, that's one of those irreversible experiences of this life, isn't it? In other words, here we are, Isaiah receiving the call, having an encounter with the God of the Bible in the context of grief. I'm sorry, but I'm more than convinced that that's probably your story and my story. And if we're honest, I think that's exactly where life is going. God is going to work through. God is going to utilize the brokenness, the craziness, the things that seem to be unsolvable, the things that they seem to be irreversible, and they might be irreversible. And yet, here is where the beauty of the gospel comes into place, that God is not approving the death of this king. So do not hear me say that God approves the tragedy. God is not approving the grief that Isaiah is facing, and the reality of potentially, some historians will say that he was a relative of Isaiah. So if you have lost a loved one, if you are in a situation where the pain is real, and you might find yourself, whether it's emotionally, physically, even spiritually numb into the reality of your grief, I am not promoting, I'm not saying that God finds pleasure on that grief. All that I'm saying is that God is able to take death in this case, and look at what happens. The reality is that he's not promising a much better future. The reality is that for Isaiah, at a very personal level, how you navigate the unresolved tension of life is through the encounter of seeing the Lord, of seeing the God who rules and who oversees and who has control in spite of our condition. So the Bible says that he saw the Lord, and when he saw the Lord, look at the description following kind of that language of royalty, that language of kingdom, experience, because he's the Lord who is high and exalted. And I'm just thinking right now, very briefly, on this transitory kingdom of this guy by the name of Uzziah. And here we have the eternality of God, speaking of the God who is sitting on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. So I'm going to say this once again. If you are going through some unresolved tension, if you are heading towards an unresolved tension in your life, my invitation, you come to Jesus, I go to Jesus, we come to Jesus, not to find the God who resolves tension. Some of us are giving up on Jesus. Some of us are giving up in our belief in God because he did not deliver the promise that he will resolve the tension. He never promised that. See, that's going to happen after you die. There will be no more tension. There will be no more, the both end of the conversation. It's going to be simply the rule, the majesty, the beauty, the glory, which I believe this is where my brother Jay is. No more pain, no more sorrow. This is the reality of the overwhelming experience of faith, facing the Lord, just like Isaiah, facing the Lord, seeing the Lord, exalting the Lord, recognizing who he is, and ultimately understanding who we are because of the covenant that God created and he made. My prayer, my desire is that throughout this weekend, as you move into the remaining of this beautiful week, that you will find yourself trusting in the trustworthiness of the God that Isaiah is portraying. My name is Vidal. I want to thank you, and we will see you guys in our next podcast. Blessings to you.